So in 1890, they decided to invade Africa. And what should be called the First World War takes place starting in the 1890s with the attack on Africa from the north by the French, from the northeast by the British, from the Horn by the Italians and the French, from the west by the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French and the British, from the central west by the Belgians, from the south by the Dutch and the Finns and the Germans, and from the east and southeast by the Germans. All of them attacked Africa simultaneously, and it is not even referred to as a war. Have you all ever had the story of this war in history? Have anybody ever talked about the Berlin Conference and what it meant? Were you?
Good evening, gentlemen, and a few of you ladies that may be listening. This is Spiritual Art of War, back at it again with another episode. And this time we're going to talk about why Africa as a continent is doomed for failure. Now, it doesn't mean the entire continent is doomed, but we're just talking about in the next, 5 to 10 years, if there's no, global war, if there's no World War III/Armageddon. The reason why Africa as a whole is screwed is because there is actually so many different things that's going on the continent in most countries that is unfixable, okay? And one of those is the colonial boundaries, right? So most of those countries were drawn by outside powers, namely the European powers, during what was known as the Berlin Conference. And aside from, a few name changes, like, Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, it's not a country, it's not a continent that's really built for, the future world. Okay, when you look at like where a lot of the countries are going in terms of like the leading countries, they're already moving on to the sixth industrial revolution. We have a lot of countries in Africa that as a whole, they're still, trying to get through the third. Okay, now there are some improvements that have been had in certain areas, and you could say, especially with mobile technology, pay on site, meaning like kind of like a similar to Cash App, that's actually been helpful for those that do, trading. And, a lot of the market is fueled for more of an entrepreneur market where people will buy goods and sell them, at higher prices. And you have people that are also involved in various areas that are also kind of booming as well. So, for example, when you look at a country that is projected to do a lot better than a lot of countries in Africa, it's going to be a country like Kenya. Okay, and one of the and many reasons why Kenya would be moving in that direction, and I've seen a lot of like videos on Nairobi and how great Kenya is to live in. And, you have very low crime. You don't have like an insurgency or like an extremist group. You also don't have like a burgeoning separatist group. You don't have, too much open ethnic conflict, although there is ethnic tension at times. There's not as much as in other places. In addition to that, you have English being spoken as the national language, and English kind of works as a vehicle. Can be good and bad because English is a vehicle that's used to transport liberalism across the globe, but also at the same time, English is very good for acquiring information and for getting your population knowledgeable about things that would help them in the world, in the coming world or whatever, or coming age. Now, when you look at countries like South Africa has like an elite or like maybe a top 10% that is poised to keep the country somewhat on track. They don't have like a high population growth. Their fertility rate is somewhat stable. but there is a large underclass of largely black natives that are not going to be able to be pulled up out the rungs, in part because of the inequality that was set in during apartheid. And because of that, those same structures economically, socially, and even politically, don't believe that because the ANC is running things or because a lot of the elected officials are black, they are still controlled and puppeted by the white ruling elite, okay? And then you're talking about all the minerals that are there in regards to natural minerals. They're never going to let that go. A lot of your land that is very vital for mining is controlled by white corporations. Now, so it's really more of an extension of the European exploitation system. However, they do have a lot more, you could say, first world amenities in a couple of their cities. In fact, there is a movement to separate, I believe, the Cape area. They want like a Western Cape independence because they want to break away from the rest of the more poorer and marginalized areas of South Africa. And I don't know how strong this push is. It does include, it's definitely led by the Afrikaners, right? But it's also, they do have like a minority of coloreds, what people would call Cape coloreds, that are, probably middle class to upper class, that also are looking to that as well. I don't know how they would feel that would help them because, you would be, you wouldn't have the numbers in a separate independent country where but at that point you would have like a larger percentage of whites in that independent country to break off. And then I think another highlighted country that I thought of as well that may be in a different direction is a country like Morocco, Algeria to a certain degree, because I've actually seen a documentary on Algeria, and they have like a first world transportation system. Algiers is a very nice place. Now, Libya would have been that. Libya probably would have been the leader of Africa under Gaddafi. And he was trying to lead an African coin, or you could say one currency system, in opening up trading, which is part of one of the biggest problems, which is actually structurally set up by the European powers, which is basically the lack of trade among the countries. Only 14% of trade in Africa happens between countries. The rest of it is happening with the rest of the world. So we're talking about like 85% of all trade is going to outside countries, but not within. And that's a major, major problem, right? Now, Morocco is definitely like a place that has like a lot of opportunity, where it's situated, right across from Europe. They also have, a bit of tourism going on. In fact, I actually seen somebody recently, one of these influencers who's like, I think he's a lawyer too. Some of you probably have seen him. IMCs, I believe. And he used to date, funny enough, he used to date Brittany Renner. And he was actually over there in Morocco. So I happened to just run across some Instagram reels, and I seen that he was like in Morocco, and it was looking really nice. He went to like a couple of different cities. So from a tourism standpoint, it's good. There's also some economic strength going on. In addition to that, you have a lot of Moroccans that are in France that have kind of, utilized the Euro money to revitalize their homeland, right? Through remittances. And a lot of times you can build certain economic structures that will benefit, your family and your town or whatever. And their proximity to Europe across the Mediterranean actually is helpful for them. But I heard there's definitely, based on the numbers, some strong economic growth. They would just need to kind of go more towards a certain route. But one thing with Moroccans, they have a strong identity. They're largely the same people. I think they call them the Amagazi people. They have like a long history in that region before they were even known as Moroccans. So, and then there's a lot of like social, and there's actually a lot of social and cultural capital that they're able to build upon to keep the unity within the country. Okay? And that's one of the things that makes a place like Morocco a place that projected could be is going in the right direction. Okay? And another country that I was also thinking of as well is Egypt. Unfortunately, the neighbors of Egypt is a problem. And, I've actually heard mixed reviews on Egypt. I think Egypt is kind of looked a certain way because of their big population, and because they're along the Nile. The Nile River is a very important region, and also they have access to the Mediterranean. However, right now they're having kind of a dispute over a dam being built, I believe, by the Ethiopians. Remember that the Nile River flows south to north, not north to south. So any construction of dams could harm, Egypt, especially if they're using it for power, right? So there may actually be like a conflict brewing between the Ethiopians and the Egyptians. And then in addition, I believe this is some time ago. I don't know if it's actually current right now, because I don't want to dig too deep into these different countries. I'm just giving more of a holistic approach to this particular conversation. Now, when you look at Egypt, I believe they're trying to move their capital to a different part of the country. So I remember seeing like a short news, basically a news story about how they're trying to build a new capital in a different part of the country. Okay, and this is something that happens, especially in Africa. This has happened before, where capitals have been moved. A lot of times, they could be moved for strategic purposes. A lot of times, it could be an ethnic issue, where maybe the original capital under the colonial powers might have been in another group's ethnic region, and therefore it appeared that they had more of access to certain things. And so if another group takes over, they may decide to switch the capital to a whole nother area. And that has happened before. In fact, we'll probably get into an example of that some other time. At least I'll dig deeper into that type of situation. So now, what's going on with generally the rest of the continent? The rest of the continent is going through different ebbs and flows. When you're looking at the Congo, it's a place where it's largely just a big labor camp because of the abundance of some of the rarest earth metals on the planet. Okay, namely one of those is coltan, but they got pretty much dang near every rare earth metal you can think of. So it's really supposed to be technically the richest country on the planet, but we know that it can't be that, because then you wouldn't be able to exploit. So therefore, there's a lot of mechanisms that are in place where you devalue currency, you bring regional instability, you put puppets in, and this is all stuff that the NATO-based governments do. Okay, it's just a reality. That's why a lot of people, when they talk about Africa, you talk about Africa as if there's not outside triggers, outside influence that's going on, the overthrowing of whole regimes and things like that are tied to the, different secret agencies. If you get my drift. Now, there are some aspects of it that the people or the leadership within Africa can control, but a lot of people don't even understand what motivates a lot of these leaders in Africa. Okay, and what motivates them is their own pockets and the pockets of their friends. That's like for the vast majority of, not the advancement of the country. One of the reasons why is because most colonial created countries never operate as a true nation state. Okay, you go and look it up and like ask Grok, ask Google AI or whatever, ask ChatGPT about what a colonial state is versus a nation state. So whenever you have create a colonial state is created for the sake of exploitation. When you keep the colonial structure, then all it's doing is continuing its very foundation as to why it was created, which is for the means of exploitation. And the thing about it is in Africa, most countries, the leadership in most countries do not want to divide it back up under, you know, ethnic national lines. And it's very funny because if you read books from the 1800s, you'll realize that who you call tribes, because the word tribe is meant to make people appear more primitive. When you read in the 1800s, they were calling these different quote unquote tribes nations. Okay? They were calling them nations. This is before 1885. Okay? And even after that, because there were a lot of times citing primary sources, they were still calling these different groups nations. This implies that these people already had nation states. It's just that a nation state requires an actual boundary and a recognized territory that's sovereign. And if you do not have your own sovereign territory, you cannot technically be a nation state. And I'm gonna give you an example of a group of people that are trying to become a nation state, which is called, self-determination, which is supposed to be allowed under United Nations, but they don't allow it for a lot of different groups of people. You look at the Kurds, okay, over there in modern day Turkey and Iraq. They want to have their own sovereign territory known as Kurdistan. That's why they have their own government. They have their own militia or paramilitary group that fights and protects on the behalf of that particular ethnic group, which has the desire to create their own independent nation state. Now, many of us were first introduced to the word or the people Kurds during the Iraq War. Before that, nobody knew what a Kurd was. Okay, about 20% of Turkey is Kurdish. Okay, and they face a lot of oppression within modern day Turkey. Now, people forget that Turkey used to be the Ottoman Empire. So when you go back to that time, that boundary of what would be considered Turkey was a lot larger because it was an empire. But you had a lot of these ethnic groups within the Ottoman Empire that were operating autonomously as their own ethnic group. And maybe they were paying probably some level of tax or whatever to the Ottoman Empire. But they were still able to keep a lot of their cultural practices, their language, and even at times unique religions. Okay, like you have the Yazidi people, right? So when you look at it, a lot of what is going on in Africa, the instability is due to its very foundational structure of those countries, which ensures that these countries will never rise up to a level of any good. Okay, and I can actually stand on that. Like, for real. A lot of these people that don't understand, and let me tell you what is actually very troubling is when you see young intellectuals from Africa, and they'll be like on these different platforms like DW, or they'll be on BBC or any of these other publications. And then sometimes they're part of these different organizations that are meant to quote unquote propel Africa to the next step, or to take the great leap, kind of like the great leap forward with Mao Zedong and, China. They have a very, this is the problem. One thing with people in Africa and just black people in general, they tend to have a lot more optimism than realism. They're either pessimistic or they're overly pessimistic, overly optimistic, but they're rarely balanced in being realistic. Okay, and I know this for a fact, that because the way that they talk as if these issues are easy to fix, they really believe that that their countries, whatever respective countries they're from, okay, that are currently corrupt and have been corrupt for the last 60 years, they have this faith, this blind faith that one day somebody is going to change it. And I'm saying somebody because one thing about Africa is they believe in a one man changing power. They really believe in that. They don't really look at it as a coalition of people working together to get things running the way it's supposed to be. So because of this, it's very easy to deceive them with someone that has a cult of personality, or you can have, ethnic tension and politics being brought in, or just flat out vote rigging that would lead to certain people staying in power, even though it doesn't benefit the rest of the country. But it's very funny about people in Africa. If there's ethnic tension or historical ethnic rivalry in whatever country, right? Said African country. One thing that's very apparent that I've noticed is that most ethnic groups in Africa are not progressive. And therefore, for them, another group of people leading them to the next level or to the quote unquote economic promised land, they don't like that. And I know this for a fact. Because you got certain groups of people, you got a lot of groups of people that are that would prefer that their person is president, even if it means that that particular person does not have the best interest for the people, just because that person is from their own ethnic group. So they'll know that this person's a thief. They'll know he's a criminal. They know he's corrupt. But they'd rather have him than a person from another ethnic group who has a history of being fair, has a history of being a great leader, has a history of not being corrupted, and has a game plan that's actually structured that if he were to be elected, that he would implement certain things that would need to be done immediately if he was president. And then there's also the government system, right? Democracy is a foreign concept to most people on the continent because a lot of them lived through authoritarian rule throughout the Middle Ages, right? So you had empires or you had kingdoms, and those are more authoritarian. Now, there is not absolute authority in a lot of those things because you had people that were at some level checks and balances, or what you would call advisors. So it wasn't like an absolute dictatorship, right? It wasn't on the level of, like, let's say Stalin or something. Some people didn't have that level of power. But, even something like Stalin is what those in the communist sphere would feel is it was needed out of necessity for radical change. Okay, that's where the radicalism comes in. So what's happening with Africa? A lot of their best and brightest will just simply leave the country and go elsewhere and take their talents to somewhere else. It might take them to South Beach. So they're going to have a brain drain and continue to experience that. Also, in addition to that, because the population is so young and there is no economic structure in most of those countries in Africa, those youngsters are going to go into nefarious activities as a means of survival or just out of frustration. Okay? So that's another thing that's, going to happen. Because if you're not creating jobs for the future, if that young group does not have a future, they're going to become a problem. That's why my old man used to always say, an idle mind is a devil's workshop. And a lot of those youngsters in Africa, they're going to be idle with no jobs. And this is happening in a lot of countries, okay, where they would graduate from a 4-year college, in their respective countries. And then they would come out and there's no job available for them. So you have some people that are just, immediately having to go into being entrepreneurs, or they might have to go back to their hometown and work for a relative who probably didn't even, study, probably dropped out of secondary school, but that's the only option they have. or they're just going to do their best to try and make their way overseas. And a lot of those visas and around the world to these quote unquote first world countries, that's slowing down significantly. So there's going to be a time when it's like you're not going to be able to do it, and they're going to have to face reality of what they have going on in their countries. But what's going to eventually happen is social unrest, and it's very easy to sway a young population that doesn't know their history to take on, being, down with certain things such as, the big G word, genocide, final solution type stuff, where they may take out their frustration on a group that is more stable. It might not even be a group that's in political power. It might be just a group that just economically is able to produce at a high level, and therefore, on average, that particular ethnic group is better off than the others. And what the others will do, they'll be envious, and then they'll turn on that particular group. Okay, and that's going to be bound to happen. Then you have like the Islamic extremist form. You've heard of, I'm pretty sure y'all heard of ISWAP and Boko Haram. They're going to be able to get more people, especially in the Muslim faction. Then you also have separatist movements, because some people may feel that whatever country that they're in, that they may need to separate from the other ethnic groups within that country in order to do what's in their best interest to survive. So rather than sticking into this makeshift fake colonial state, let's go ahead and break away and create a nation state, so that way we can have proper growth, we can control what's ours, and we can know exactly what we want to do irrespective of what these other groups want. So that's pretty much all I got to say. I'm going to probably give some actual good examples. This is more of an intro of what I think about why Africa is bound to fail. So let me know what you think in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next episode.